Every military textbook has a chapter on what not to do when outnumbered. Don't get surrounded. Don't tighten your perimeter. Don't let the enemy close in from three sides. Retreat. Call for reinforcements. Avoid encirclement at all costs. These aren't suggestions. They're written in blood from centuries of warfare. So, on the night of September 12, 1942, on a small island in the Pacific, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson looked at his 800 Marines, looked at the intelligence reports showing 2,500 Japanese troops closing in, and made a decision that violated every single one of those rules. He ordered his men to dig in, to tighten the perimeter, to let the Japanese surround them. And what happened over the next 8 hours will show you why some commanders are remembered as tactical geniuses, and why some Japanese officers went back to their brass admitting they'd just gotten their entire brigade destroyed. If you've wondered what separates legendary military leadership from mediocre command, this is the answer. Welcome to History of World War II, where we don't just tell you what happened in World War II. We explain the why behind decisions that changed the course of history. If you've been with us since the beginning, thank you. If you're new here, hit subscribe because this story proves why one leader's confidence in preparation beats an enemy's numerical advantage every single time. To everyone who's been in the comments on our channel, we hear you. We see the criticism about AI narration, about accuracy, about story quality. That's exactly why we're here. To do the research, get the details right, and tell you the real story behind these moments. This isn't a recycled summary. This is the tactical breakdown of why Edson's decision, as counterintuitive as it seems, was actually the only decision that would have kept those 800 Marines alive. And if you're into military strategy, leadership decisions, or just want to understand how preparation beats panic, this story is going to change how you think about defensive warfare. September 12, 1942. Guadalcanal. By this point in the Pacific War, the Japanese military had a reputation that preceded them. They were disciplined, they were relentless, and they seemed willing to absorb casualties that would break any other military in the world. Their night assault tactics had worked repeatedly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. They'd overwhelmed smaller garrisons. They'd forced American commanders to retreat from seemingly defensible positions. But Edson's situation was different, and worse. His 800 Marines had been fighting on Guadalcanal for over a month. They were exhausted. They were malnourished. Tropical diseases were running through their ranks. Ammunition was running low. Supplies were limited. And they'd just returned from a raid on a Japanese position at Tasimboko, less than a week before this fight, meaning they didn't have weeks to study the terrain and prepare a defensive position. They had days, maybe less. Meanwhile, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was moving through the jungle with approximately 2,500 men, a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. These weren't conscripts. These were experienced Japanese infantry who had proven they could execute complex night assault operations. Japanese tactical doctrine was built on exactly this scenario: overwhelming numbers, coordinated night attacks, exploiting darkness to make American firepower irrelevant. The numbers told a story: 800 versus 2,500, and according to every tactical manual, doctrinal principle, and historical precedent, that story should have ended with the Japanese breaking through and recapturing Henderson Field. Instead, something else happened. Here's where Edson's tactical thinking separated him from commanders who would have made the predictable choice. Most commanders facing encirclement retreat to better defensive terrain. They extend their perimeter. They try to create gaps that are too wide for the enemy to infiltrate. They hope reinforcements arrive before they get overwhelmed. Edson did the opposite. He deliberately tightened his perimeter, not out of desperation, but out of calculated tactical advantage. He allowed the Japanese to close in from multiple directions. He accepted encirclement. He voluntarily moved his forces into a tactical situation that looked on paper like it would result in his annihilation. But here's the key insight that separates this from simple suicidal tactics. Edson understood something about warfare that Japanese commanders had failed to account for. The advantage of a tightened perimeter isn't that it's easier to defend. It's that it concentrates your firepower into overlapping fields of fire that make encirclement a liability for the attacker, not the defender. Think about it tactically. When you have a dispersed defensive line, attacking forces can probe for weak points. They can concentrate their assault against a single sector. They can achieve breakthrough if they achieve local numerical superiority. But when you deliberately tighten your perimeter to create interlocking fields of fire, you've just solved a fundamental problem of defensive warfare. You've eliminated safe approaches to your position. The Japanese would have to come uphill toward the ridge. They'd have to come through terrain that Edson's Marines had cleared fields of fire through. Every approach route would be covered by machine guns positioned to fire across the attacking force, a tactic called enfilade fire that maximizes the effect of each burst. And here's where Edson's preparation became the real advantage. Most people, when they think about military victories, imagine dramatic moments, great speeches, tactical maneuvers, individual heroism. What actually decides battles like Edson's Ridge is something far more boring: mathematics. Edson spent the days before this engagement doing something tedious but absolutely critical. He and his officers physically measured distances across the ridge. They surveyed approach routes through the jungle. They calculated firing solutions for their artillery and mortars. They pre-registered targets for weapons they couldn't see yet. Here's why this matters. When darkness falls and visibility drops to zero, pre-registered fire becomes the difference between accurate fire and wild shots in the dark. The Marines had mortars positioned to drop rounds into specific grid squares with precision, even when the mortar crews couldn't see their targets. The artillery batteries at Henderson Field, standing by with 105mm howitzers, had pre-sighted their guns on predetermined target areas. American forward observers had been trained to call in fire missions using sound and muzzle flash signature rather than visual observation. This is the infrastructure of modern defensive warfare, and the Japanese were about to walk directly into it. But firepower alone doesn't decide battles. You also need the weapons themselves. And here's where American equipment gave the Marines an advantage that Japanese tactical doctrine hadn't accounted for: the weapon disparity. The Marines were equipped with Springfield M1903 rifles. Bolt-action weapons, yes, but they were equipped to semi-automatic standards through training and discipline. Each Marine could put accurate fire downrange at rates that trained riflemen could sustain, multiple rounds per minute from disciplined shooters. But the real firepower advantage came from their machine guns. Browning M1917, water-cooled heavy machine guns. Let me explain why this specific weapon was decisive. A water-cooled machine gun is heavy, 41 pounds just for the gun, not including the tripod or ammunition. It requires 2 men to operate effectively. It's slower to move than a light machine gun because of that water jacket that circles the barrel. But that water jacket allows the weapon to sustain fire at rates of 400 to 600 rounds per minute for prolonged periods without the barrel overheating and becoming inaccurate. Compare that to air-cooled machine guns, lighter, more portable, but they have to stop firing periodically to let the barrel cool. In a night engagement lasting 8 hours, where sustained fire was the difference between holding the line and getting overwhelmed, the Browning's water-cooled design was a decisive advantage. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, and here's where accuracy matters because the audience knows the difference, was with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, during the October fighting on Henderson Field. But the tactical lessons about how machine gun crews fought on Guadalcanal apply directly to this ridge engagement. A skilled machine gunner positioned to enfilade approaching forces could lay down sustained fire that no amount of Japanese courage could overcome. These weapons, combined with careful positioning, created a mathematical problem that Kawaguchi's forces literally couldn't solve. Kawaguchi's staff officers had compiled intelligence reports about American defensive capabilities. They understood that American forces had superior firepower in terms of raw output, but they made a critical assumption that Japanese military thinking encouraged that American discipline and cohesion would break under pressure. Japanese tactical doctrine was built on the assumption that offensive action, no matter how costly, would eventually overwhelm defenders who lacked the spiritual warrior mentality that Japanese soldiers supposedly possessed. This was a profound misunderstanding of American military culture. American Marine Corps training emphasized something completely different: individual initiative combined with disciplined execution of a coordinated defensive plan. Marines weren't trained to hold ground through willpower alone. They were trained to understand why they were holding a position, to grasp the tactical situation, and to make decisions without waiting for direct orders. The moment a Japanese infiltrator tried to circle around a defensive position, an American squad leader could identify that threat and deploy his men to counter it, without waiting for a radio message from battalion. When Japanese noise and movement disrupted the normal acoustic environment, American Marines with their acoustic training could use that information to adjust their fire. These weren't attributes that showed up in Japanese intelligence reports. Kawaguchi's assault was planned according to traditional night attack doctrine: coordinated assaults from multiple directions, designed to achieve breakthrough through speed and shock action, before American firepower could be concentrated against the main threat. What Kawaguchi didn't fully grasp was that American firepower couldn't be concentrated against a single threat, not because the Americans lacked the ability, but because Edson's positioning meant that machine gun fire, mortar fire, and rifle fire were already positioned to cover every approach. The Japanese were about to learn an expensive lesson about the difference between tactical doctrine written in peacetime and tactical reality discovered under fire. The tropical night of September 13th deepened over Guadalcanal as Edson's Marines settled into their defensive positions. Every man knew what was coming. The intelligence was clear. Kawaguchi was moving into assault positions. The Japanese would attack after darkness provided cover. And when that attack came, everything, survival, the control of Henderson Field, the entire strategic situation in the Solomon Islands, would depend on whether 800 exhausted, hungry, malnourished Marines could hold a low ridge of coral and volcanic rock against an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. At approximately 11:45 p.m., Japanese mortar rounds began falling on the ridge, poorly coordinated, scattered explosions that suggested the Japanese indirect fire weapons were still moving into final firing positions. The shelling served its intended psychological purpose. It announced to the Marines that the theoretical battle they'd been preparing for had just become very real. Within minutes, they would be fighting for their lives. At midnight, the jungle erupted. Japanese infantry emerged from the tree line approximately 300 yards south of the ridge, their voices raised in the traditional Banzai battle cry that had become the psychological calling card of Japanese night assaults. To American defenders, that sound meant thousands of enemy soldiers were committed to the attack. That retreat wasn't an option for either side, that the next few hours would determine the outcome. What happened next revealed the fundamental gap between Japanese tactical doctrine and American defensive reality. The first wave. The Japanese charged up the southern slopes of the ridge in a human wave assault, hundreds of soldiers advancing through the darkness with fixed bayonets relying on speed and shock action to overwhelm the American defensive positions before the defenders could organize effective resistance. Instead, they ran directly into the mathematics of Edson's prepared defensive system. Browning machine guns positioned to enfilade the primary approach routes opened fire. The guns weren't shooting blindly into darkness. They were firing into pre-registered target areas where American forward observers had already calculated range and bearing during daylight reconnaissance. Each burst from a machine gun capable of 600 rounds per minute sent a stream of .30 caliber bullets across the width of the advancing Japanese formation. At ranges of 600-800 yards, those bullets were still traveling with sufficient velocity to penetrate Japanese uniforms and inflict fatal wounds across an area measuring dozens of yards wide. The psychological effect on Japanese soldiers expecting to close the distance quickly and achieve breakthrough was catastrophic. They were being shredded by firepower they couldn't see from positions they couldn't locate in the darkness. Marine riflemen, equipped with Springfield rifles and trained to fire effectively in low-light conditions, added their fire to the machine guns. Every Marine had been instructed beforehand about the importance of controlled, disciplined fire, rather than the panicked spray that inexperienced troops often resorted to under pressure. The first wave of Japanese assault began losing cohesion at approximately 400 yards from the Marine positions. By the time the attacking soldiers reached 200 yards, the assault had fractured into scattered groups of men, seeking cover and returning fire against an enemy whose positions remained concealed in darkness. American mortar crews, operating according to pre-calculated firing solutions, dropped high explosive shells into the areas where Japanese forces were concentrating. These mortars weren't being guided by visual observation. They were being operated according to coordinate grids that had been surveyed during daylight hours. Each mortar round that detonated in the darkness created a brief stroboscopic flash of light that revealed the landscape to every American in the defensive perimeter, while simultaneously remaining invisible to Japanese soldiers outside the impact area. The result was asymmetrical awareness. American forces had fragmented information about where Japanese soldiers were located, while Japanese forces remained largely in darkness about where American firepower was positioned. By 2 a.m., Kawaguchi's first assault had completely lost momentum. His forces had suffered catastrophic casualties, hundreds of dead and wounded scattered across the approaches to the ridge. The Marines had successfully repulsed the attack while sustaining fewer than 50 casualties. But Kawaguchi wasn't defeated. He still had thousands of troops. He still had numerical superiority, and he was about to attempt something different. Kawaguchi had learned something from the first failed assault. The frontal attack approach, massing forces against the American defensive line, resulted in systematic casualties inflicted by American firepower positioned to cover predictable approach routes. His second assault would be different. Instead of continuing frontal attacks that allowed the Marines to concentrate firepower against clearly defined target areas, Kawaguchi divided his remaining forces into smaller infiltration groups. The Japanese would sacrifice the psychological impact and momentum of traditional banzai charges in favor of tactics that might actually achieve penetration through stealth and coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. This adaptation showed that the Japanese general understood the tactical situation, at least partially, but it also represented a fundamental misunderstanding of American tactical flexibility. The infiltration problem. Small groups of Japanese soldiers began attempting to work their way around the flanks of the Marine defensive position, using ravines and areas of particularly dense vegetation to mask their approach from American observation. The Marine response demonstrated the true genius of Edson's defensive arrangement. Rather than committing all his reserve strength to static positions behind the main defensive line, Edson had created mobile response teams, his most experienced Marines, veterans who could operate effectively in small groups without direct supervision, and who understood the peculiar challenges of jungle combat where visibility was measured in yards. When Japanese infiltrators managed to penetrate close to Marine positions, these counterattack teams responded with overwhelming firepower, concentrated precisely where Japanese soldiers were attempting to establish footholds. This produced a tactical situation where the infiltrators' advantage of mobility and dispersion was negated by American defenders, who could respond rapidly to threats in any sector. The fighting during this phase of the engagement was fundamentally different from the earlier exchanges. Individual Marines found themselves locked in close-quarters combat with Japanese soldiers who had penetrated to within 30 yards of defensive positions. The engagement ranges were so close that there was no time for aimed fire, no opportunity for tactical analysis. Private First Class Robert Mard, a young Marine who had arrived on Guadalcanal barely 3 weeks earlier, heard movement in the undergrowth and turned to see a Japanese infiltrator rising from concealment with a grenade already armed and ready to throw. Mard's rifle cracked once. The Springfield's heavy .30 caliber bullet struck the enemy soldier and dropped him instantly. The grenade rolled harmlessly down the slope. These moments, individual combat decisions made in conditions of near-total darkness and psychological pressure, determined the battle's outcome as much as the pre-registered artillery and coordinated machine gun fire. But the crucial difference was this. American Marines operated according to a doctrine that encouraged these individual decisions. Japanese soldiers, operating according to their own doctrine that emphasized strict adherence to orders and predetermined plans, struggled when circumstances required adaptation beyond what their orders specified. The crisis moment. At approximately 3:45 a.m., a Japanese infiltration group managed to approach within grenade range of one of the critical machine gun positions on the ridge. Barcelona's crew, representing the continuous legacy of Marine machine gun excellence from this period forward, found themselves under direct attack from enemy soldiers, emerging from concealment with grenades and fixed bayonets. What followed was desperate close-quarters combat, where survival depended on sheer physical strength and the will to continue fighting even when wounded. One Japanese soldier actually reached the machine gun before being killed with a burst from a Thompson submachine gun. For a moment, the American defensive system was threatened with penetration. But that moment passed when supporting Marines from nearby positions identified the threat and responded with overwhelming fire that eliminated the Japanese attack group before they could establish a position from which to direct sustained fire against the machine gun emplacement. This was the decisive point in the battle. By attempting to disperse his remaining forces into small infiltration groups, Kawaguchi had sacrificed the mass and momentum necessary to achieve breakthrough operations against prepared defensive positions held by disciplined troops operating according to a doctrine that emphasized individual initiative and rapid response to threats. Each infiltration group was defeated individually before they could link up and create the kind of coordinated threat that might have actually achieved penetration of the defensive perimeter. As dawn approached on September 14th, Kawaguchi faced a fundamental military reality. Continued assault in daylight conditions against defensive positions commanding excellent fields of observation and fire offered virtually no prospect of success. His forces had suffered catastrophic casualties. Hundreds of dead and wounded littered the approaches to the ridge. His assault formations had lost cohesion and momentum. The Marines remained in firm control of their positions. The tactical situation had shifted from Japanese offensive capability to Japanese survival. At approximately 5 a.m., Kawaguchi's forces began withdrawing from their attack positions. Their retrograde movement covered by mortar fire that was poorly coordinated and largely ineffective against Marines who had learned to seek cover at the first sound of incoming shells. American observers watched through field glasses as scattered groups of enemy soldiers retreated through the jungle, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades in their haste to escape the killing ground around the ridge, before daylight made withdrawal even more costly. Edson ordered his forces to maintain their defensive positions, rather than conducting pursuit operations that might expose Marines to ambush or lead them into prepared enemy positions beyond the immediate battlefield. The colonel understood that his primary mission had been defensive in nature, to hold the ridge and prevent Japanese forces from threatening Henderson Field. He had achieved that mission with a tactical victory that exceeded all reasonable expectations given the disparity in forces. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scale of Japanese defeat in statistical terms that military analysts would study for decades. Reconnaissance patrols moving through the battlefield counted over 700 enemy bodies scattered across the approaches to the ridge. Additional wounded soldiers were evacuated during the retreat or left behind in the jungle to die from their wounds. Compare that to Marine casualties, fewer than 50 killed and wounded combined. This casualty exchange ratio, approximately 14 Japanese soldiers killed for every American casualty, seemed almost impossible to military professionals studying the preliminary force dispositions. 3-to-1 numerical disadvantage, 800 Marines should have been overwhelmed. Standard doctrine would have predicted a bloodbath with American forces getting surrounded and destroyed. But the casualty ratio wasn't achieved through luck or chance. It was the direct result of several compounding factors working together. First, terrain mastery. Edson's Marines had spent weeks studying every fold in the ground, every piece of cover that attacking forces might use, every approach route that offered concealment. This intimate battlefield knowledge allowed defenders to engage Japanese forces at every stage of their assault, from the moment they emerged from the jungle tree line until they either died or retreated. Second, weapon superiority and positioning. The Browning M1917 machine guns, positioned to enfilade approach routes, delivered sustained firepower that bolt-action Japanese rifles simply couldn't match. A single Browning crew could inflict casualties across an entire width of attacking formation. Multiple Brownies positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire created a mathematical problem that raw numbers couldn't solve. Third, American tactical training. Marine Corps doctrine emphasized individual initiative combined with disciplined execution. This allowed American defenders to adapt to Japanese tactical changes, infiltration tactics that required close quarters fighting without losing cohesion. Japanese tactical doctrine, which emphasized strict adherence to predetermined plans, struggled when circumstances required real-time adaptation. Fourth, American logistics and discipline. The Marines were armed primarily with Springfield M1903 rifles. Bolt action, yes, but operated with the efficiency of semi-automatic weapons through training and discipline. These rifles, combined with grenades and supporting machine guns, created the kind of firepower density that could suppress Japanese assault formations at critical ranges. Fifth, leadership and preparation. Edson's decision to deliberately tighten his perimeter, counterintuitive though it was, demonstrated sophisticated tactical understanding. By accepting encirclement, he concentrated his firepower in a way that made that encirclement a liability for the attacker. The pre-registration of artillery, the careful surveying of approach routes, the pre-sighted mortar positions, these weren't improvised responses to crisis. These were the deliberate preparations of a commander who understood that survival depends on preparation more than on individual heroism. Kawaguchi's failure at Edson's Ridge effectively ended Japanese offensive capabilities on Guadalcanal and marked the beginning of a strategic shift that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. The battle demonstrated conclusively that American forces could defeat numerically superior Japanese formations through superior training, firepower, and tactical doctrine that emphasized defensive preparation and coordinated employment of modern weapons systems. It proved that Japanese confidence in their night assault tactics and the spiritual superiority of their infantry was misplaced. American Marines, equipped with better weapons, trained according to doctrine that emphasized adaptability, and led by commanders who understood the mathematics of firepower and defensive positioning, could systematically destroy Japanese formations regardless of numerical advantages. The implications reverberated through the Pacific War. Future Japanese commanders understood that they couldn't rely on numerical superiority or traditional night assault tactics to overcome American defenders. This realization contributed to a strategic shift toward defensive operations and fortified positions, rather than mobile assaults. For American military planners, Edson's Ridge validated the approach to training, equipment, and tactical doctrine that the Marine Corps had developed. The lessons learned here, about the importance of defensive preparation, about machine gun employment, about terrain mastery, became foundational principles for American operations throughout the Pacific. Here's what separates Edson's tactical genius from commanders who would have made different choices. The conventional approach would have been to extend the perimeter, create gaps too wide for the enemy to penetrate, and rely on reinforcements to relieve the position. Edson's approach was to deliberately concentrate his forces, to accept encirclement, and to transform that encirclement into a tactical advantage through positioning, firepower, and preparation. This decision violated every instinct that military doctrine encouraged. It looked on paper like it would result in annihilation. Reconnaissance patrols moving through the battlefield counted over 700 enemy bodies scattered across the approaches to the ridge. Additional wounded soldiers were evacuated during the retreat or left behind in the jungle to die from their wounds. Compare that to Marine casualties, fewer than 50 killed and wounded combined. This casualty exchange ratio, approximately 14 Japanese soldiers killed for every American casualty, seemed almost impossible to military professionals studying the preliminary force dispositions. 3-to-1 numerical disadvantage, 800 Marines should have been overwhelmed. Standard doctrine would have predicted a bloodbath with American forces getting surrounded and destroyed. But the casualty ratio wasn't achieved through luck or chance. It was the direct result of several compounding factors working together. First, terrain mastery. Edson's Marines had spent weeks studying every fold in the ground, every piece of cover that attacking forces might use, every approach route that offered concealment. This intimate battlefield knowledge allowed defenders to engage Japanese forces at every stage of their assault, from the moment they emerged from the jungle tree line until they either died or retreated. Second, weapon superiority and positioning. The Browning M1917 machine guns, positioned to enfilade approach routes, delivered sustained firepower that bolt-action Japanese rifles simply couldn't match. A single Browning crew could inflict casualties across an entire width of attacking formation. Multiple Brownies positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire created a mathematical problem that raw numbers couldn't solve. Third, American tactical training. Marine Corps doctrine emphasized individual initiative combined with disciplined execution. This allowed American defenders to adapt to Japanese tactical changes, infiltration tactics that required close quarters fighting without losing cohesion. Japanese tactical doctrine, which emphasized strict adherence to predetermined plans, struggled when circumstances required real-time adaptation. Fourth, American logistics and discipline. The Marines were armed primarily with Springfield M1903 rifles. Bolt action, yes, but operated with the efficiency of semi-automatic weapons through training and discipline. These rifles, combined with grenades and supporting machine guns, created the kind of firepower density that could suppress Japanese assault formations at critical ranges. Fifth, leadership and preparation. Edson's decision to deliberately tighten his perimeter, counterintuitive though it was, demonstrated sophisticated tactical understanding. By accepting encirclement, he concentrated his firepower in a way that made that encirclement a liability for the attacker. The pre-registration of artillery, the careful surveying of approach routes, the pre-sighted mortar positions, these weren't improvised responses to crisis. These were the deliberate preparations of a commander who understood that survival depends on preparation more than on individual heroism. Kawaguchi's failure at Edson's Ridge effectively ended Japanese offensive capabilities on Guadalcanal and marked the beginning of a strategic shift that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. The battle demonstrated conclusively that American forces could defeat numerically superior Japanese formations through superior training, firepower, and tactical doctrine that emphasized defensive preparation and coordinated employment of modern weapons systems. It proved that Japanese confidence in their night assault tactics and the spiritual superiority of their infantry was misplaced. American Marines, equipped with better weapons, trained according to doctrine that emphasized adaptability, and led by commanders who understood the mathematics of firepower and defensive positioning, could systematically destroy Japanese formations regardless of numerical advantages. The implications reverberated through the Pacific War. Future Japanese commanders understood that they couldn't rely on numerical superiority or traditional night assault tactics to overcome American defenders. This realization contributed to a strategic shift toward defensive operations and fortified positions, rather than mobile assaults. For American military planners, Edson's Ridge validated the approach to training, equipment, and tactical doctrine that the Marine Corps had developed. The lessons learned here about the importance of defensive preparation, about machine gun employment, about terrain mastery, became foundational principles for American operations throughout the Pacific. Here's what separates Edson's tactical genius from commanders who would have made different choices. The conventional approach would have been to extend the perimeter, create gaps too wide for the enemy to penetrate, and rely on reinforcements to relieve the position. Edson's approach was to deliberately concentrate his forces, to accept encirclement, and to transform that encirclement into a tactical advantage through positioning, firepower, and preparation. This decision violated every instinct that military doctrine encouraged. It looked on paper like it would result in annihilation. The 800 Marines who held that ground against overwhelming odds had proven that determination and fighting spirit meant nothing against professional competence, superior firepower, and leadership that understood how to transform defensive positions into killing zones. As the sun rose over Guadalcanal on the morning of September 14, 1942, painting the jungle canopy in shades of gold and green, the Marines on the ridge looked out across a battlefield that testified to the price of tactical miscalculation and the decisive importance of defensive preparation in modern warfare. General Douglas MacArthur, who would become Supreme Commander of the Allies in the Pacific, studied the battle reports with interest. He understood that what had happened on that ridge represented a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. American forces had proven they could defeat Japanese formations that outnumbered them. This insight would influence American strategy for the remainder of the war. The 509th Composite Group, other Marine units, and American commanders throughout the Pacific took lessons from Edson's Ridge about the importance of terrain, preparation, and the concentrated employment of firepower. The Japanese, meanwhile, would continue assaulting American defensive positions throughout the war. But the confidence that their tactical doctrine was superior to American approaches, that spiritual superiority and night assault tactics could overcome technological disadvantage, that confidence died on the slopes of Edson's Ridge. To everyone who's been watching this channel and calling out when we get things wrong, thank you. That criticism pushes us to research harder, to get the details right, to tell these stories accurately. To people new to this channel who are skeptical about AI-generated content, I hear you. And that's exactly why we focus on accuracy, on explanation, on the why behind what happened rather than just recycling basic facts. Edson's Ridge is a story about preparation, about leadership making counterintuitive decisions based on understanding the fundamentals of warfare. Those principles matter whether we're discussing World War II or modern military strategy. Hit that subscribe button. We've got more deep dives into the Pacific War coming. Stories about Medal of Honor recipients, about the battles that changed strategy, about commanders who understood the mathematics of warfare. Turn on notifications so you don't miss them. Drop a comment. What surprised you most about Edson's decision to deliberately tighten his perimeter? Do you see parallels to modern business or military strategy? And if you notice historical details that don't match other sources, leave those in the comments too. We read them all, and accuracy matters. Thanks for being part of this community. Semper Fi to the Marines on that ridge. See you on the next one.